Lauren had not planned on moving back to the Carolina coast, but when the lease on her apartment expired and her restaurant finally began to bring in enough revenue to allow for some stability, she decided she needed more than just a place to sleep. After endless shifts, she needed a home that carried some sense of permanence and meaning. The small house she bought was nothing glamorous. A weathered two-story place with faded shutters and a backyard that had been left to choke itself with weeds for what looked like several years. But to Lauren, it was a canvas. Her late husband had once spoken of having a garden that felt like a sanctuary. Not the manicured square lawns the neighborhood seemed to worship, but something untamed and textured, filled with flowering kale, medicinal herbs, and pollinator plants. It would draw bees and butterflies. That vision had remained with her long after he passed away, and when she first stepped into the neglected yard, smelling the salt air from the nearby marsh and seeing the tangled vines pressing against the broken fence, she knew she could bring that vision to life in her own way. From the first days of work, when she cleared away the dead brush and hauled rotted wood to the curb, she noticed glances from her neighbors, some curious, some disapproving, but none more pointed than those of the woman who lived 2 houses down. Karen. Karen was older, but not frail, with the posture of someone who believed she had earned authority simply by existing in one place long enough. Her yard was aggressively symmetrical, trimmed hedges in identical cubes and grass so bright and uniform it looked like an artificial carpet. When Lauren waved at her during one of her early cleanup sessions, Karen returned a glance that felt more like an inspection than a greeting, eyes sliding over the heap of dirt and compost bags before moving away without a smile. Lauren told herself it was nothing, just an overly strict neighbor, but over the following weeks she felt the scrutiny whenever she was outside planting or carrying soil, as if the air itself carried disapproval from that direction. Still, the garden became her therapy. After long evenings at the bar where she worked, she would kneel in the soil, placing seeds in rows, mapping out the mixture of vegetables, herbs, and wildflowers, and she felt her own grief loosening, like roots being carefully lifted from hardened ground. She did not want to replicate the sterile suburban look that the Homeowners Association encouraged, the kind of uniformity where every mailbox matched and every flower bed had the same mulch color. She wanted life and complexity, a piece of earth that carried her husband's memory. It was exhausting but deeply rewarding, and as shoots began to break through the soil, she felt proud, even protective, of the space she was reclaiming from neglect. The first conversation with Karen happened casually, on an afternoon when Lauren was adjusting a trellis for climbing beans. Karen strolled by, wearing a broad-brimmed sun hat, holding her phone like a notepad, and after a brief nod she said, "You know, this street has always valued neatness. The board likes consistency. Your little farm project might be a bit much." The tone was sweet enough to disguise the sting, but Lauren caught the weight of the words. She replied politely, explaining she was building a pollinator garden and had approval for raised beds, yet Karen only smiled thinly and remarked, "As long as it doesn't turn into compost piles and chicken coops." Then she continued her walk, leaving, Lauren with the peculiar feeling that she had just been warned rather than welcomed. Over the next month, the tension remained subtle but tangible. At the first rainstorm, Lauren noticed strange slick patches forming in certain corners of the yard, patches that did not behave like ordinary mud, almost greasy to the touch. She dismissed it as residue from old fertilizers left by previous owners, but when the smell lingered, an acrid, metallic scent carried up by the damp air, she felt uneasy. The plants did not seem affected at first, and she convinced herself she was overthinking. Yet something about Karen's lingering glances, her way of slowing down whenever she walked past the fence, began to link itself in Lauren's mind with the unease that clung to the soil. The house itself carried enough repairs to keep her busy, peeling paint, a squeaking stairwell, a leaking gutter, but it was the garden that became the true anchor of her days. She could almost ignore the unspoken rules of the neighborhood, the perfectly edged driveways and seasonal wreaths, because within the small wild square of her yard she felt free. What unsettled her, however, was the way Karen occasionally spoke to others on the street, leaning toward them in conversation, gesturing with her hands toward Lauren's property, after which the neighbor's eyes would slide briefly toward the garden, before quickly looking away. It was not confrontation, not yet, but it was the quiet beginning of pressure, a tightening circle of disapproval that seemed to form without anyone openly acknowledging it. One evening, after locking up the bar earlier than usual, Lauren sat on her back porch with a glass of wine, watching the shadows stretch across the beds of the herbs and flowers. For a moment she felt content, the kind of fragile peace that comes after years of loss and struggle, and she thought about how her husband would have laughed at the stubbornness of the kale surviving in the sandy soil. Then she heard the faint sound of footsteps on the sidewalk out front, too slow and deliberate to be a jogger, and when she leaned to look, she caught sight of Karen again, pausing near the edge of her driveway, staring in silence at the garden, before resuming her walk as if nothing unusual had happened. It lasted only a second, but it carried the weight of a message Lauren could not yet decipher, a promise or a threat, woven quietly into the rhythm of the neighborhood. The first real sign that something was wrong came not with a confrontation or a letter from the association, but from the garden itself, the one place Lauren believed was safe from manipulation or intrusion. It was late spring, warm enough that the air held the heavy scent of blooming magnolias from the street trees, when she walked out one morning to find that her row of calendula, hardy and sun-loving, had collapsed overnight as though scorched. Their stalks bent at strange angles, and the petals had lost all color, shriveled into a sickly gray. At first she thought perhaps she had overwatered, or that some blight had taken hold, but when she reached down to touch the soil, her fingers came away slick, coated with a residue that felt unnatural, almost like oil. She scrubbed her hands in the sink afterward, disturbed by the faint metallic odor that clung to her skin long after the water had run clear. Lauren was not an alarmist by nature. Running a small bar had trained her to approach problems with pragmatism. Broken equipment, unexpected bills, arguments between patrons, each demanded calm solutions rather than panic. But she had also learned to recognize when something didn't add up, when a problem was not the result of carelessness or chance, but of something deliberate. Within days, more plants followed the calendula. The beans she had carefully trellised began to curl and blacken at the tips, while the marigolds planted to ward off pests withered as though touched by frost even in the heavy humidity of June. The decline was uneven, confined to certain patches of the garden, and always in areas where runoff from the neighboring yard seemed to settle after a rain. She drove a small bag of soil samples to a nearby garden center, hoping for a simple explanation. The technician, a young man in overalls who smelled faintly of fertilizer, peered at the samples under a magnifying lens and frowned. He mentioned abnormal levels of solvent traces, the kind not typical in home gardening, and suggested perhaps some old paint thinner or cleaning agent had seeped into the soil. "Could be runoff from somewhere uphill," he added casually, sliding the samples back across the counter. Lauren nodded, thanked him, and drove home with her mind turning sharply toward the obvious. Karen's property sat slightly higher, and her drainage trench emptied almost directly at the corner of Lauren's fence line. Still, suspicion was not proof, and Lauren hesitated to accuse without evidence. She watched more closely after storms, noticing how rivulets carried cloudy water from Karen's backyard, leaving streaks across the gravel and eventually trickling into her garden beds. On more than one occasion, late at night, she caught the faint metallic smell again, sharper in the damp air, as if something volatile was evaporating from the wet soil. She began to worry not only for the plants but for her own health, wondering what she might have inhaled during hours of tending to the garden. When she finally mentioned the problem to the police after another round of damage, the officer at the desk listened politely but with evident disinterest. He explained that without clear evidence of tampering there was little they could do, that disputes between neighbors over gardening practices and runoff were common in suburban developments, and suggested she raise the issue with the homeowners association instead. Lauren left the station feeling dismissed, carrying with her the sense of being a nuisance rather than a resident reporting something serious. What unsettled her further was Karen's demeanor during this period. If before her glances had been disapproving, now they carried something colder, more measured, as though she were waiting for Lauren to speak first. One afternoon, Lauren returned from work to find Karen standing at her fence, hands folded neatly in front of her, looking down into the garden with a peculiar smile. She said nothing, only offered a slow nod before walking back across her perfect lawn. It was not friendliness, not even mockery, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if she knew precisely what was happening and expected Lauren to realize it too. Out of desperation, Lauren tried to create a barrier, piling sandbags along the fence where the runoff pooled most severely. Within days, she received a letter from the association, citing her for unauthorized modifications impacting neighborhood drainage aesthetics. The phrasing was so absurd she laughed aloud at first, but the implication was serious. Someone, almost, certainly Karen, had reported her, and the board had sided without hesitation. The sandbags had to be removed, or she would face fines. She complied, unwilling to invite more trouble, but the moment the barrier was gone, the runoff returned, and with it more damage. Her frustration hardened into determination. She began keeping a small journal, recording the days of rainfall, the state of the plants, and any unusual odors or residues. She noted the times Karen was outside, what containers she carried, even the direction she poured water when tending her own yard. It was not paranoia, not anymore. It was methodical observation. The entries soon revealed a pattern. After nights when Karen had been seen carrying unmarked buckets or canisters toward the drainage area, the next day brought new signs of damage in Lauren's garden. Yet she also noticed something else, something that made the hair on her arms rise. Occasionally, when she walked the neighborhood in the evening, she saw similar discolorations in other yards. Patches of grass yellowed in unnatural shapes, ornamental plants shriveled despite recent rains. The owners shrugged it off as bad soil or pests, but Lauren began to wonder whether her garden was simply the most obvious target because it stood out, wild and alive against the uniform backdrop. The possibility that Karen's runoff was not just an annoyance but a hazard spreading silently through the neighborhood made her stomach tighten with dread. The situation reached a breaking point when, one morning, Lauren discovered a cluster of dead earthworms on the surface of the soil, their bodies twisted, as though forced upward by something toxic beneath. The sight struck her harder than the loss of any flower because it was unmistakable. The soil itself was being poisoned. She called the Environmental Services line for the county, explained the sequence of events, and was told to submit a formal complaint. Days passed with no response. When she called again, she was informed that her case number did not exist in the system. Lauren stood in her kitchen that evening staring at the wilted stems visible through the window, her hands clenched on the counter, and realized she was no longer dealing with a petty disagreement about landscaping. This was deliberate destruction, carried out with a precision that suggested calculation rather than negligence, and the institutions meant to help her either could not or would not intervene. The neighbor, who smiled with icy politeness from across the fence, was not simply eccentric or controlling. She was dangerous, and Lauren was suddenly very much alone in understanding just how dangerous. Lauren had expected the conflict to remain subtle, an exchange of looks, perhaps more complaints delivered through the rigid channels of the association. But the moment she decided to act directly rather than passively endure the decay of her garden, everything shifted into a darker and more tangible form of hostility. It began when she hired a local irrigation specialist, a middle-aged man named Howard, who carried himself with the weary pragmatism of someone who had seen too many badly designed suburban lots. He crouched at the fence line, measuring slopes and tracing the drainage flow with a bright orange stick, and when he returned to her porch with his report, The look on his face was uneasy. He explained that the runoff coming from Karen's yard was unusually concentrated, carrying not just silt but residues that smelled of solvents, the kind used in stripping paint or cleaning industrial machinery. He muttered almost to himself. Back in the 80s, they'd bury drums up in these neighborhoods when land was cheap. Sometimes it leaks for years. Or someone decides to make their own shortcuts. When Lauren pressed for clarification, he shook his head, unwilling to say more, and advised her to install a barrier system to redirect the flow, though he added that the homeowners association might resist such a visible modification. Determined not to let her garden die without a fight, Lauren followed his advice and built a wooden retaining border along the fence, discreet enough that it blended with her trellises. For the first time in weeks, after a heavy rain, the garden stayed dry, the soil clean, the herbs standing upright instead of collapsing into foul-smelling muck. She felt a surge of relief, fragile but intoxicating, believing she had finally found a solution. That relief lasted less than 3 days. Returning home one evening, she discovered the barrier dismantled, boards neatly stacked beside the fence as though someone had performed the removal with care rather than vandalism. The message was unmistakable. Her attempt to resist had been noticed and it would not be tolerated. The next morning, as if coordinated to underline the futility of her efforts, a letter arrived from the association citing her for unauthorized modifications affecting neighborhood drainage patterns. The phrasing mirrored exactly what Howard had warned, but what chilled her was the speed with which the violation notice arrived, barely a day after the barrier's disappearance. Someone had filed the complaint immediately, and the board had acted without inquiry, without offering her even a chance to respond. It was not a coincidence. It was collaboration, a subtle alliance between her hostile neighbor and the faceless mechanism of the HOA, a system that wielded rules as weapons. Lauren began keeping her journal more rigorously, logging not only rainfall and plant health but also every appearance of Karen outside her house. She noticed how often Karen carried containers that bore no labels, how she sometimes wheeled a cart covered with tarp toward the side of the yard that sloped into the shared drainage trench, how she moved with the furtive haste of someone who preferred not to be watched. One evening, unable to contain her suspicion, Lauren lingered by the upstairs window and saw Karen, long after sunset, crouching near the trench with a small metal pail, pouring its contents directly into the soil. The liquid caught the reflection of the porch light for an instant, glistening with a strange iridescence before vanishing into the earth. Lauren's breath caught in her throat. There was no longer any doubt. She considered marching out, confronting her neighbor then and there, but the thought of standing in the dark accusing someone who would surely deny everything made her hesitate. Instead, she resolved to escalate the matter officially. She contacted the county's environmental office again, this time requesting a written acknowledgement of her complaint. They promised an inspector would be assigned, but weeks passed with no visit, no confirmation, and when she called back she was told that her case file could not be located. The voice on the line, polite but hollow, suggested she resubmit her request through the Homeowners Association for proper processing. The circle closed again, leaving her trapped between hostile neighbors and indifferent authorities. The escalation turned from bureaucratic to personal in small but unmistakable gestures. One morning she discovered her compost bin overturned, the rotting scraps scattered across the walkway, though no wind had blown and no animals had left tracks. Another day, her recycling bins were pushed into the street, lids open, contents spilling under the tires of passing cars. Each incident was trivial in itself, easy to dismiss as coincidence, but taken together they painted a portrait of harassment designed to wear down her patience. More disturbing was the sense of being watched. She would kneel in the soil and feel eyes on her, glance up and see Karen at her own window, standing motionless, face unreadable. The unease deepened into fear. The night Lauren heard footsteps near her side gate, slow and deliberate, not the hurried scamper of children or the aimless wandering of an animal. She waited in the darkness, heart hammering, until the sound receded. In the morning, she found the gate ajar, though she remembered locking it, and beside the garden bed lay a shallow puddle that reeked faintly of ammonia. She wrote it all down in the journal, knowing that her words were fragile evidence but clinging to them as a lifeline against the gaslighting denial she anticipated. Despite her exhaustion, Lauren refused to abandon her garden. She replanted, using new soil in containers elevated from the ground, determined to salvage what she could. The act was not just about vegetables or flowers anymore. It was about refusing to surrender to the quiet hostility that sought to push her out. Each seed she pressed into the soil became a declaration. Each trellis repaired a reminder that she would not be erased from the neighborhood so easily. Yet, beneath her determination simmered a growing certainty. The conflict was no longer about aesthetics or gardening choices. It had become a deliberate campaign, a battle fought in the shadows of property lines and bylaws, and it was escalating towards something far more dangerous than she could yet see. By midsummer, the conflict had shifted from irritation and suspicion into a pattern of deliberate moves and counter-moves that left Lauren constantly tense, waiting for the next strike. She had documented every incident, every overturned bin, and every unexplained chemical stain, but the accumulation of notes in her journal did not change the reality that her plants continued to die and that Karen moved about the neighborhood with the untouchable confidence of someone who believed she would never be held accountable. The sense of futility grew heavier each day, and yet it was precisely at this breaking point that Lauren stumbled on the first piece of information that suggested the situation was not merely the petty cruelty of one obsessive neighbor, but part of something far larger and darker than she could have imagined. It began, almost accidentally, when Lauren decided to search the county's online archive for permits related to drainage and landscaping. She had no illusions about uncovering anything dramatic, expecting only to find the same vague documents the homeowners association had waved at her when she first questioned their decisions. But late one night she typed in Karen's address and discovered a file she could barely understand, dense with technical jargon and chemical references. What caught her attention was not the content itself, but the fact that it was marked as restricted, a designation she had not seen on any other neighbor's file. The next day, she drove to the county office, intent on asking directly, but the clerk at the desk became strangely evasive, insisting the file was internal and not available to the public. The refusal was delivered with a practiced blandness, yet the way the clerk's eyes flicked nervously toward the back office before sliding the folder out of reach made Lauren's skin prickle. She left without protest, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Her unease grew into alarm a week later when she returned home in the late afternoon and found a man she had never seen before standing near her compost bin. He wore the uniform of a landscape maintenance worker, green shirt and khaki pants, and carried a clipboard. But when she asked what he was doing, he responded vaguely that he had been called to investigate an odor complaint. Lauren pressed further, asking which company he worked for, and his answers grew inconsistent, first naming one local firm and then correcting himself with another. By the time she reached for her phone, he muttered something about a mix-up and walked briskly toward the street, disappearing into a white van parked too far away to read the markings. That night she called both of the companies he had mentioned, and both denied sending anyone to her address. The next morning she discovered a small adhesive label on her mailbox, a circle with a series of numbers and letters written in faded ink. At first, she thought it was a delivery code or some careless sticker left behind by the postal service, but when she mentioned it to her neighbor across the street, an elderly man who had lived there for decades, he became uncharacteristically serious. Lowering his voice, he told her he had once seen similar tags appear on properties before a series of unexplained inspections years ago, and he warned her to be cautious, though he refused to elaborate further. The conversation ended abruptly when his wife called him inside, and Lauren was left with the unsettling sense that others in the neighborhood knew more than they would admit. Her attempts to seek help through official channels remained fruitless. She contacted the Environmental Services Office again and demanded a timeline for inspection, only to be told that her case had been reassigned and then inexplicably closed due to lack of substantiated evidence. When she asked what evidence had been reviewed, the representative grew defensive and ended the call. The Homeowners Association, meanwhile, escalated its campaign, sending another violation notice accusing her of creating conditions inconsistent with community standards, and demanding she remove several of her raised beds. The letter was signed not by the usual secretary but by the chair herself, a woman who rarely became directly involved, which told Lauren that Karen's influence had reached higher than she had suspected. It was during this period of frustration that Lauren turned to less official avenues. At the urging of a sympathetic coworker, she contacted a local gardening group, hoping someone might have advice or experience with similar situations. Among the emails she received was one from a retired agronomist who lived 2 towns away. His message was concise but startling. Based on her descriptions, he suspected her soil contained residues not of household cleaners but of restricted agricultural chemicals, substances that had been banned for decades due to their persistence and toxicity. He urged her to avoid further exposure and offered to test a sample in his own lab. Desperate for clarity, Lauren drove out the next day and delivered a bag of soil. When he called her 3 days later, his voice carried a gravity that made her grip the phone tighter. He explained that he had detected traces of compounds linked to industrial pesticides, the type once used in large-scale operations but strictly controlled under federal law. They were not the sort of substances one could buy at a garden center, nor even at most commercial suppliers. "This isn't runoff from old paint thinner," he said. "If what I'm seeing is accurate, someone is handling materials they have no legal right to possess." He recommended she contact environmental enforcement agencies immediately, warning her that further contamination could render her property hazardous. Lauren felt both vindicated and terrified. For weeks, she had suspected deliberate poisoning, but hearing the confirmation from an expert shifted her understanding from personal sabotage to something that carried implications for the entire neighborhood. She pictured children playing in nearby yards, pets sniffing at the soil, rain washing residues into the storm drains that fed the marshlands beyond. The scope of the threat was far greater than her lost marigolds and herbs, and the thought of it made her stomach turn. Her determination solidified into resolve, but even as she prepared to escalate the matter, she could not ignore the growing sense that she was being monitored. More than once, she noticed cars idling at the end of the street, unfamiliar vehicles with drivers who pretended to check their phones but lingered longer than seemed natural. Packages she ordered for the bar arrived slit open and hastily retaped, though nothing appeared missing. When she mentioned this to a friend, he joked about paranoia. But Lauren knew what she felt, the eyes of others on her life, invisible but constant. The midpoint of the conflict revealed itself not through a single explosion of violence but through this convergence of clues. The restricted county files, the false inspector, the coded sticker, the expert's alarming discovery. Together, they drew a picture of a neighbor whose activities extended beyond petty harassment into the realm of illegality, supported, or at least shielded, by structures of authority unwilling to intervene. Standing at her kitchen window one evening, looking out over the sagging remains of her once vibrant garden, Lauren realized she was no longer simply protecting her own property. She was standing at the edge of uncovering something much larger, something that explained Karen's cold smile and the quiet complicity of the Homeowners Association. And she understood that whatever path she chose next would drag her into a conflict that reached far beyond her backyard fence. Lauren had expected that once she had the agronomist's report in hand, the situation would finally shift in her favor, that the authorities would be forced to acknowledge the seriousness of what was happening and act accordingly. But what followed, instead, was a descent into a more insidious and frightening stage of conflict, one in which Karen's hostility grew bolder, the Homeowners Association acted with sharpened precision, and Lauren herself began to feel that her entire life was being systematically dismantled in preparation for something she could not yet see. The first blow came when she received an official notice taped to her front door, claiming that she was under review for potential violations of local hazardous waste regulations. The irony was so cruel that at first she laughed bitterly, standing there on her porch in the humid evening, staring at the bold black letters that accused her of improper storage and disposal of chemicals. It was a complete inversion of the truth, but the notice carried the county seal and a demand that she appear for a compliance inspection within 2 weeks. When she tried to call the number provided, she was placed on hold for nearly an hour before being told by a curt voice that her case was pending review and that no further details could be released. The timing was too neat, too perfect to be coincidental, and Lauren understood at once that Karen was no longer satisfied with poisoning her garden in secret. She was maneuvering the bureaucracy itself into position against her neighbor, twisting the narrative so that Lauren would become the culprit in the eyes of outsiders. This suspicion deepened when a letter arrived from the Homeowners Association, citing anonymous complaints that she had been burning toxic materials in her backyard. The language was laced with feigned concern for community safety, but made clear that further incidents could result in fines or even a lien placed against her property. Lauren had never lit a fire on her property beyond the occasional candle, yet the accusation hung over her like a shadow, and she realized that the tactic was not about truth but about burden. Each new claim forced her to defend herself, to spend time and energy proving negatives while Karen continued her quiet campaign undisturbed. Her fear turned physical the night she returned home to find her side gate wide open and muddy boot prints leading across her patio. Nothing inside the house appeared disturbed, but on the kitchen table, which she had cleared before leaving, lay a single dead bird, its feathers slick with an oily residue. She stood frozen in the doorway, the metallic scent stinging her nose, until she managed to scoop the carcass into a bag and shove it into the trash bin outside, her hands trembling as she locked the doors and windows twice over. She considered calling the police but knew already what their response would be. Without evidence of forced entry, they would dismiss it as an accident or a prank. Yet the message was clear, even if unspoken. Someone had crossed into her sanctuary, leaving behind a symbol that made her feel both violated and exposed. The next escalation came not from the garden, but from her work, the one place she believed remained separate from the conflict. One morning, the health inspector arrived unannounced at her bar, citing a complaint about improper cleaning agents. The inspection was grueling, every corner of the small kitchen examined, every bottle of sanitizer scrutinized, and though nothing significant was found, the disruption was enough to rattle her employees and plant rumors among regular customers. When Lauren asked quietly if the inspector could share the origin of the complaint, he gave her a look that was half apologetic, half cautious, and said only that it had been filed anonymously. She drove home afterward with her jaw clenched so tightly that her teeth ached, the realization dawning on her that Karen's reach extended even into her livelihood. The neighborhood itself began to shift in tone. Where once her neighbors had offered polite greetings, now they avoided her eyes, conversations halting abruptly when she approached, whispers following her down the sidewalk. Someone spray-painted a crude symbol on her fence, a looping shape that meant nothing to her but filled her with dread nonetheless, and though she scrubbed it away the next morning, the faint outline remained, a ghostly reminder of how quickly perception could be turned against her. Even the mail became a tool of harassment. Envelopes arrived already torn, packages were left in puddles despite clear weather, and once she discovered an unmarked envelope containing only a clipping from an article about property seizures due to hazardous contamination. Lauren fought back in the only ways she could, filing counter-complaints, photographing every incident, updating her journal with meticulous detail, but the effort left her drained, and she began to notice the toll it was taking on her body. Sleep came fitfully, broken by sudden jolts awake at the sound of imagined footsteps, and her appetite dwindled until meals became a chore. She told herself she could not afford to collapse, that surrendering now would mean allowing Karen's narrative to become reality, but the weight of isolation pressed heavily. It was in this fragile state that she made the decision to escalate her fight beyond the local channels that had failed her, sending the agronomist's report and her compiled documentation to a federal environmental agency rather than the county. She hesitated before pressing send, knowing it would draw attention not only to Karen but to herself, but the thought of remaining silent was no longer bearable. What she did not anticipate was the speed of the reaction. Barely a week later, while she was watering the few surviving plants in her elevated containers, 2 unmarked vehicles rolled slowly down the street and parked near Karen's house. Men in plain clothes stepped out, carrying cases that looked nothing like gardening tools, and though they did not approach her directly, Lauren felt the shift immediately. The balance of power had altered, even if only slightly, and Karen, watching from her porch, must have felt it too, for her smile that evening was gone, replaced by a taut stillness that promised the conflict was far from finished. For Lauren, the escalation had reached a new stage, one where the stakes were no longer confined to her dying garden, but had expanded into the realm of official investigations, hidden files, and consequences neither she nor her neighbor could fully control. Lauren had braced herself for weeks of waiting, for the usual stalling and denials that had followed every previous complaint, but the turning point came with an abruptness that left her stunned. It was early morning when she woke to the sound of engines outside, not the idle hum of delivery vans but the deeper growl of official vehicles. She pulled back her curtain and saw the street lined with dark SUVs, their windows blackened, and men in heavy jackets marked only with bold white letters moving with swift coordination. Neighbors stood clustered on their porches, whispering, while agents in protective masks and gloves converged on Karen's house with a precision that carried the weight of inevitability. Lauren stepped onto her porch, her heart pounding, unable to believe what she was witnessing, and yet feeling the undeniable recognition that this was the moment her private nightmare would finally be exposed to the world. Karen appeared in her doorway, her figure stiff, one hand gripping the frame as though she could hold back the tide with sheer stubbornness. She began shouting something about rights and property lines, her voice high and shrill, but the agents ignored her, moving past with sealed containers and instruments that looked more suited to a laboratory than a suburban street. Within minutes, the garage was opened, and the sight that emerged sent a ripple through the gathered neighbors. Stacks of unmarked barrels, their lids corroded and stained, stood against the walls, alongside rows of plastic jugs with faded symbols that still carried the warning marks of toxicity. One agent held up a clipboard, calling out codes, while another photographed everything with a camera that flashed harshly in the dim interior. Lauren's breath caught when she heard the word neurotoxin, spoken by one of the masked specialists. The term, clinical yet terrifying, rang in her ears as the agents began sealing evidence into reinforced cases. This was not fertilizer, not paint thinner, not the harmless garden additives that Karen had pretended to pour into her soil. This was dangerous material, outlawed substances that had no place in a residential neighborhood, and the thought that she had been inhaling traces of them while kneeling in her own garden made her stomach twist with nausea. For a moment, she felt lightheaded, gripping the railing of her porch to steady herself, the enormity of it pressing down upon her. Karen's composure shattered as the reality unfolded. She stepped into her driveway, screaming that she was being framed, that the chemicals were stored for legitimate research, that Lauren had fabricated lies to destroy her reputation. Her words spilled in frantic streams, but the agents gave her no acknowledgement beyond a calm recitation of her rights as they placed her in handcuffs. The neighbors, once wary and silent, now murmured openly, their expressions a mixture of horror and vindication. A few glanced toward Lauren, and though she felt no triumph, she recognized that for the first time she was no longer the isolated target of suspicion. As the search extended into the backyard, more evidence emerged. Pits where residues had been dumped, hidden beneath carefully arranged layers of mulch, and a drainage pipe that ran directly into the shared trench, its outlet stained with chemical runoff. The agents documented everything, and one approached Lauren briefly, asking if she had noticed unusual odors or discolorations in her soil. She nodded mutely, her voice failing her, and the man scribbled notes before returning to the swarm of activity. She realized with a shudder that her meticulous journal, once dismissed as obsessive, would now serve as vital corroboration. The climax of the raid came when one of the larger barrels was moved onto the driveway and its lid partially opened under controlled conditions. A foul vapor escaped, acrid and metallic, strong enough that even from her porch Lauren covered her mouth. The lead agent barked an order, and within seconds a section of the street was cordoned off with yellow tape. Neighbors urged back into their homes while additional protective units were called. The sight of men in full hazmat suits arriving on her quiet suburban street was surreal. An image burned into her memory as the day when the hidden war she had fought in silence finally erupted into undeniable visibility. Through it all, Lauren felt an odd mixture of fear, relief, and exhaustion. Fear, because the scale of the contamination suggested she had lived for months in proximity to something that could have caused irreversible harm. Relief, because the truth was now irrefutable, and no amount of Karen's influence could erase what lay in plain sight. Exhaustion, because the months of tension, of whispered threats and overturned bins and poisoned soil, had culminated in a moment so vast she could hardly process it. As Karen was driven away in the back of an unmarked vehicle, still shouting through the open window, Lauren closed her eyes and let out a breath she did not know she had been holding, aware that the fight was not over, but comforted by the knowledge that at last she was no longer alone in it. In the weeks that followed the raid, the neighborhood carried an atmosphere unlike anything Lauren had known before, as though the carefully painted facades of suburban order had been stripped away to reveal something raw and unsettled beneath. The Homeowners Association, once so quick to issue violation notices and fines, fell into a stunned silence, its meetings postponed indefinitely, its leaders avoiding eye contact when they passed her on the street, and, though no official statements were made, word spread quickly that several members of the board had resigned under quiet pressure after investigators uncovered records of ignored complaints and deliberate suppression of reports that might have exposed Karen earlier. The whispers of complicity confirmed what Lauren had long suspected, that her battle had not been against one woman alone, but against a system that had chosen convenience and reputation over truth. For Lauren, the return to normalcy was slow, because the soil itself still carried scars of contamination, and entire sections of her garden had to be stripped and replaced under the supervision of environmental specialists. Yet when she watched the first clean truck arrive, unloading pallets of fresh topsoil and protective barriers, she felt a cautious sense of renewal, as though the land was not ruined but waiting patiently to be healed. Neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid her now stopped by to offer apologies or quiet words of encouragement, some even volunteering to help replant when the time was right. And while she accepted their gestures without bitterness, she knew that trust, once fractured, would never be quite the same. Karen's house stood empty, its windows dark, its driveway stained by the traces of the barrels that had been hauled away under tarps, and though rumors swirled about her fate, indictments, federal charges, a trial delayed by endless filings, Lauren, no longer cared to follow every detail. For her, the victory was not in seeing her neighbor punished, but in knowing that the nightmare was over, that the garden she had built in memory of her husband could finally grow without being shadowed by poison. On the evening she pressed the first new seeds into the restored soil, she lingered for a long while on the porch, listening to the quiet hum of crickets, and understood that survival was not measured in triumphs shouted to the world, but in the steady act of reclaiming life after someone had tried so hard to erase it.